We are going to have to do more with less. If you're unable to tap into what the labor market has to offer, including those without traditional college degrees, you're really constraining your ability to find talent and compete in an economy that has a shrinking workforce.
Non-credit programs are opening new pathways into the workforce. Are businesses and HR professionals ready? Next on A Third of Your Life.
You spend a third of your life at work. We're all about making it better. This is the Rutgers School of Management and Labor Relations podcast.
There are more than 1 million education credentials in the United States, and it's estimated that half of them are not college degrees. We're talking about certificates, certifications, badges, licenses, and other credentials. Many have no uniform quality standards. So how do you know if the person you're hiring really has the skills needed to do the job? Welcome to A Third of Your Life. I'm Steve Flemish, and our guest host is Michelle Van Noy, the director of the Education and Employment Research Center in the Rutgers School of Management and Labor Relations. Michelle and her team are studying this rapidly changing landscape, and today she's talking with two leaders who have a big stake in the labor market. Jason Tyszko, Senior Vice President of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation, representing businesses, and Clayton Lord, Director of Programs for the SHRM Foundation, the Society for Human Resource Management, representing HR professionals. Now, on A Third of Your Life, Michelle Van Noy.
Thanks for being here. I really am excited to begin this conversation. It's an ongoing conversation among us here over many years, but really reflecting on the current state of affairs related to non-degree credentials, non-credit education, all these sort of alternative pathways that are emerging to the workforce and that are really quite important in our economy and quite important in the lives of many individuals. And I think we're all thinking about lots of questions around this emergence of interest and proliferation of these kinds of credentials and what it means for policy and for practice and for data and for consumers and employers and individuals alike, in terms of how do we think about quality, how do we make sure that these credentials are doing what they're intended to do. As you all know, at our center here at Rutgers, at the Education and Employment Research Center, we've had the opportunity to study a lot of this work. And through that study, we've engaged with you both in your work at SHRM and at the Chamber Foundation about all the efforts that you have in this area, and really recognizing that we're in a bit of a moment now with such interest since the pandemic in adults trying to pursue this kind of education and just the need for it. States across the country investing a lot of money in this, and employers trying to make sense of this proliferation of credentials. I think one estimate shows that over a 500,000 non-degree credentials are offered. So there's a lot to make sense of in our landscape. And at the same time, while we have so many credentials, we don't have a lot of quality standards, and we don't have a lot of data, and we don't have a lot to go on in terms of policy and practice. So I'm excited to have a chance to talk with you both about the work that both of you are doing in your organizations, sort of trying to navigate this Wild West, and to think about what this all means for businesses and for leaders in human resources, and how to really make the system work for everybody. So I'd love to just start off with what you're hearing from folks in your communities about these issues around non-degree credentials. So Jason, if you want to start, and then Clay jump in, just share with us a little bit about what you're hearing. What are some of the key issues here?
Well, there are many issues. What I'll perhaps lead with is where a lot of our attention has been is really rendering a lot of these credentials, whether degree or non-degree, more transparent. And what we mean by that is, what are the skills and learning outcomes they represent? And there's two kind of different ways of thinking about issues like quality and trust. One is, can I trust that, for example, I made a claim about Clayton? And there's the technical layer of that, which is, I made the claim. There's enough trust and verification there that it came from me. But then there's this other issue around, okay, well, do you trust me? Am I someone that should be making the claim? And have I done it in a rigorous way? And how do you know? What we've really been focusing on at the Chamber Foundation through our efforts is really on the technical side of that, to say, can we at least do better at transacting skills and learning outcomes, whether that is conveyed through non-degree credentials or whatever you want to call it, including learning and employment records, or LERs. And then we can get to the other issues around trust and quality in terms of, should I have been making the claim? Did I do it in a trusted way? Do you think I have enough quality assurance in place that I can make that claim, and that claim Clay can then use to go get learning credit for it towards a degree option, for example? So lots to unpack there, but a lot of this is theoretical until you get down to saying we've got a lot of data that we actually have to deal with, and we're trying to make that data a reality. So I think what you're going to see now in the future is a lot more decentralized technology at work, where people are going to be empowered with data about their skills and learning outcomes, which can be packaged in the form of traditional credentials or non-traditional credentials, or in the form of transcripts, which again, depending on which community you're in, these words can mean different things. What is a credential to the technical community versus what is a credential to the higher ed community? To the technical community, it's just a box you put things in. To the higher ed community, to employers and others, credential might actually have a deeper cultural meaning significance. So a lot of this is we don't want to talk past each other, because we often may use the same terms differently. But I think what we're trying to focus on, what we think is going to be a continuing trend, at least in the near future, is organizations like the Chamber Foundation, SHRM, and others coming together around saying, how do we make this entire ecosystem more transparent? And by transparent, I mean we can unbox whatever you want to call it and understand what is inside it and who made the claims. And that's actionable data. It's not a PDF image that we're transacting, but people are being powered with data about skills and learning outcomes that could then be used in a resume presentation when applying for a job. It's machine readable and actionable. We can unpack that more, but we're going to get the data infrastructure right. And you're going to have a lot more transactional data about skills and learning outcomes flying around. And then we're going to have those hard conversations around other quality assurance issues like, okay, well, a university said this, a training provider said that, the US Chamber says this employer over here says that, and what counts? And what's the new criteria for what counts and what doesn't? And what's that look like in the federal workforce system versus the higher education system versus K-12? So lots to unpack here, but hopefully that was a nice entree into some of the issues. But I think we got to get the technical layer right. And then there's going to be a lot more to debate because of all of that great data that's going to be out there. We're going to have some really good conversations about what's quality and what does it mean in the eye of the beholder.
Well, and it's so interesting because Jason and the Chamber and me over here at SHRM and SHRM Foundation, we're really trying to tackle the same part of that question, which is employer adoption. And I think Jason's answer, everything that he said is on point. I think we're spending a lot of time and energy on maybe the sort of side of that is more about the natural inclinations of humans. And all of that technology is absolutely going to be required as we think about how to get employers, which are made up of humans trying to do their job, to be set up to do something new. And whenever you're talking about change management, which is essentially what that is, there are certainly dominoes you have to set up and knock down. What we are finding is that the general adoption among employers of skills-based hiring and advancement philosophies is pretty low. The general acceptance of it is very high. So about 90% of HR professionals say that they abstractly get on board with the idea that someone who is a star, who's skilled through alternative routes, can be as good or better as the person who has a traditional degree. But only about 15% of them say that they feel confident in their ability to act on that. And it's a much smaller percentage who we think actually are acting on it. And when you dig into that, trust and quality is a big part of it. But I would just say it's trust and quality under pressure too. And part of what's going on here, and Jason sort of hinted at this, is that right now, HR and employers more broadly have built the ability to do their jobs on first a set of technologies and second, a set of things that serve as proxies for the quality of a candidate. And one of the big things that serves as that proxy is the four-year degree. And so if we're trying to figure out an alternative that atomizes the skills, as Jason is talking about, and allows people to adjudicate the quality of individual skills instead of presuming the quality of the package that those skills are put in, we have to do it with a layer of technology and other support that makes it as easy or easier for an HR professional to do their job or for a hiring manager to do their job. And right now, that's a huge pressure. There's data that says that on average, a resume is looked at for 6 seconds in order to make a choice about it. Our anecdotal data from focus groups is that HR professionals sometimes have 5 minutes to look at 200 resumes and determine the top 5 candidates from those resumes. And so they're not against the idea of adjudicating the quality of a person and their candidacy in a way that's more holistic, but they don't know and haven't really been able to trust that there's an alternative to how they're doing it. It's going to not make their job harder, not increase their risk and the risk of the quality of the candidates they're going to get. It's not going to get in the way of that sort of core function of being an HR professional, which is to balance care of people and culture with compliance with all of the rules and regulations that go into making a workplace function.
Michelle, could I build on?
Yeah, please.
Clay zeroed in on the employer perspective around, okay, well, if there's going to be better data about these things, how does it impact our workflow? And that's not just a technical workflow, that's a human workflow. So change management is critical. But let's flip that on its head, because that's like an employer receiving data and using it differently to make a hiring decision. When you flip it, there's also another compelling trend around, you're going to have a lot more issuers out there of what you may call non-degree credentials, I might call records. We should actually ask, are we talking about the same thing? But the big kind of the buzzword, if we're talking like quality, trust, change management, it would be experience. And I think you're going to see in the near future a lot more easy to access tools that are going to allow individuals, as well as others working with those individuals, like your employer or your supervisor, who are going to be able to create better documentation about your experiences, whether it's an employment experience, a work-based learning experience, an experience in your community. And as we are producing data and packaging that data in the form of a record or quote unquote credential, think about all the different types of credentials we could then have out there. So as more and more people are surfacing this data and empowering you with it, individuals are going to have to curate all of this information as they are preparing themselves for continuing education, for employment opportunities, for how they want to present themselves on the web for whatever reason they may have. But I think that's another important trend to look at. And I like to jokingly say when I hang out with my friends over at ACRO that, you know, employers will be the new educators, HR will be the new registrar, and LER will be the new transcript. And just the idea there, a little tongue in cheek, is just, we're going to have the ability for all that lifelong and life-wide learning that we talk about to actually be transcribed and documented. Now, does that fall under the category of non-degree credential? I don't know, but we're going to have to potentially reckon with that future. And I think it's a major opportunity, and we're going to have to sort out a lot of different policy issues around that.
It's a really big shift, I think you're describing in the landscape about how we recognize skills and learning and think about hiring. And I guess I want to ask you both a question about kind of our current context and maybe how we find ourselves in this moment potentially of transformation. And I'm curious just to hear a little bit about what you're hearing from members in terms of the labor market and how some of the kind of dynamics in the labor market might be motivating some of these trends, and to what extent you're still hearing, is the labor market still tight? Are folks having a hard time finding qualified applicants? Is that part of what is driving this, or is this part of a bigger transformation that's at work, maybe accelerated by these trends? I'm curious to hear your thoughts and what you're hearing from your members.
I think it's both for sure, in that what we're seeing is that the spaces that are on the employer side, the spaces that are most enthusiastically actually doing things are the spaces where the kind of pressure in the form of a kind of desperation for qualified candidates is the strongest. And so, there are great examples of new and innovative ways of not only assessing the skills of a person, but also developing the skills of a person through earn and learn models or things like that in the electrical space, where they're looking for linemen and linewomen who are going to need to be trained on doing that, or in the CNA space, the certified nursing assistant space, where there are tens of thousands of empty jobs that really cannot be filled at the pace that the current model requires. And so you're seeing CNA programs that are emerging out of non-credential settings, whereas they used to really be tied up with either a 2 or 4 year degree. And that's in part because there is a perception, and I think Jason maybe got at this a little bit with his joke about employers becoming the educators. I think more and more, if employers can't find the solutions they're looking for with the current education system, they are finding the solution either with skill tech at vendors or on their own. And that's particularly true for the biggest companies because they have sort of more money to burn on this question, right? But even in smaller situations, particularly sort of in that mid-sized space, there are sort of really innovative models where sometimes they're working with their local community college system, and the community college system is flexing more in order to create certificates or sort of short of degree educational opportunities. Sometimes they're collaborating with different organizations that are then providing bespoke credential-based training. And sometimes they're actually leaning into practices that they've had for a long time that we would call skills-based hiring and retention strategies, but they call the way we hire people, and sort of continue to do that in order to find the folks that they need without necessarily relying on the proxy of the degree. And I mean, I think to Jason's point earlier, it's sort of important to note that we're not talking about a dichotomy between degree-based hiring and skill-based hiring. It is all skill-based hiring. It's just a question of how you package the skills. And it's also a question of the definition there. So it has always been the case that people use the degree as a proxy for understanding or presuming that someone has both hard skills as well as soft skills and aptitudes that they have gathered up in that very special place known as college. And what is shifting now is an understanding that maybe college doesn't actually always give you those things, at least as a default. And so maybe you need to test whether someone actually has those skills and aptitudes and gifts. And then also that there are lots of different ways that you can accrue those different skills and aptitudes and gifts that don't extend to the degree, but then there's the corresponding desire to package them in a way that is consumable quickly so that you can determine someone's quality and put them in the pool and get them hired. That's, I guess, what we're seeing is an increased desire in the places where there is the most need for that desire, where they kind of can't find the folks. And then also you've got that other side that you were talking about, which is particularly among the largest companies, the ones who I think simultaneously can look 10 years in the future and can feel like they can invest in that 10-year future now. And then also that feel like they have some sort of aspect of a CSR lens that they can lay into it, that they are making deep investments in this space for themselves. But in part, that's a business strategy because they know that within the next 10 years, they're really going to be hurting if they haven't created this infrastructure to pull in folks who don't have degrees into quality positions.
Michelle, I'll make just 3 quick points building on what Clay shared. First is, what we've heard from the Chamber's members is that it's not like degrees are going away or college or experience or all these. There's a lot that goes into a job posting and what the requirements are for a job and how a candidate is vetted. But where there's kind of feels like universal consensus within the private sector is that we need to do a better job at identifying and validating skills for any given position. So it's the one thing we can improve on. And by doing so, we think we can actually help create a more equitable labor market. There could be many reasons for why a company might not want to ask for a degree now. But we know for a lot of them, they're trying to create pathways into their jobs because the degree requirement is causing a position to go unfilled for long periods of time. And frankly, they're not seeing kind of the return on that, where I might make some assumptions about the degree being a proxy for X, Y, and Z. But then when I'm actually working with the person, I realize those assumptions were wrong. So it's becoming less and less of a quality signal about what someone knows and is able to do, or certain aptitudes, or even things like persistence. And I think employers are saying, like, we're not getting what we need out of this proxy, therefore we need to be asking something different. Not to say we're getting rid of it, but there has to be a better way of going about this. And by doing that, we think some of the other advantages will be there's going to be more opportunities for a larger share of the workforce to potentially enter our jobs. And a lot of companies are very interested in that. So the second point I wanted to make is that the reality that we're living in within that context is the labor market shrinking. For many places in our country, the prime working age population is going down. And there's nothing going to happen on the short-term horizon that's going to change that trend. So we are going to have to do more with less. And if you're unable to tap into what the labor market has to offer, including those without traditional college degrees, you're really constraining your ability to find talent and compete in an economy that has a shrinking workforce. And then the other thing we need to recognize in that context is our labor force has always been a majority of non-college degrees. We tend to talk about those with college degrees as if they're the majority in the workforce. And it's just not, it's never been the case. So we have to tap into the talent we have. We have to meet the workforce where it's at. And it's not to say we don't want to give access to those post-secondary opportunities and degrees to individuals. But if that's not reaching enough people, how are we going to create pathways into good jobs? And we think that this conversation can help us there. And then the last thing is, okay, let's say we're doing more skills-based hiring. Let's say we're dropping some degree requirements. If Clay shows up on my door and says, hey, I'm glad you took away that degree requirement. Here's a list of my skills. Well, what evidence do I have that Clay actually has those skills if I don't have an education partner conferring a degree? So what evidence are you giving me that you know and are able to do these things or have demonstrated these things in the context that resonates with me as the person making the hiring decision? Well, is it an assessment product? Is it just take Clay's word for it? Did somebody provide a letter of recommendation? Eventually, it's going to get down to what evidence do you have to back up the claims you're making in your job application or within the context of your resume? And that is where I think there can be a rich market for non-degree credentials, because if they do a better job of saying, I have a way of validating the skills that you are hoping to present to others, like prospective employers, if I don't have the degree, what do I have as evidence? Non-degree credentials could be a powerful signal of trust in that context.
Just to throw it in really quick, I think we're also at a moment where trust in the blanket 4-year degree as having conferred all of those skills is declining among employers. I mean, Jason, you referenced this, right? But that means that sort of atomization of skills and the requirement to then confirm that someone has them is now becoming a ubiquitous thing, whether you have the degree or not. And again, just to go back to sort of the first thing I said, that's a lot of work, right? And it's a lot of work put on a group of people who don't have a lot of time to do work differently. And so when I talk to folks in the sort of ed tech space, or when I talk to educators in the traditional education space, the number one thing I say to them is, look, you all built a car and it's a beautiful car, but you forgot to tell the driver that you were building a new car for them. And you have made it incredibly complicated for them to drive. So if you want them to drive it, you have to make it simpler. And then you also have to incentivize them to use the new car. And eventually that incentive is going to be that 10 years from now, the old car is going to break. But if you want them to do it sooner, you have to meet them where they are and understand that it is a good thing to atomize skills. It is a bad thing to atomize skills and not give people the tools that they need to adjudicate those atomized skills quickly.
You're really getting at the heart of some of the questions here that we're thinking about. I think both of you talking about the role of non-degree credentials, skills-based hiring, learning and employment records, LERs. How do these all fit into this new world of hiring? And I'm really curious to hear from you both about what your sense is from your members, from folks that are on the ground trying to hire. I mean, I hear you, like hundreds of resumes in just a few minutes to sort through them. What are you seeing in terms of how hiring managers are responding to this new landscape and all these new options and the new car that, is coming out there and they don't quite know what to do about it? What are you hearing, and what are some of the practices that you think are promising to help facilitate that adoption where it's helpful?
Yeah, I'll just build on what Clay had introduced earlier on the importance of change management. When I started on our workforce portfolio at the Chamber Foundation, we put out this idea that, employers that are experiencing chronic skills gaps or the inability to attract quality talent can't just rely on the spot market. They need to proactively build a talent supply chain. And a lot of folks have talked about that as, isn't that a clever metaphor? But no one actually moved beyond the metaphor. We actually went and built a change management framework. We developed a curriculum. We deployed it through an academy, and that became our talent pipeline management initiative. And it's now, we have talent supply chains in 44 states in Canada and several other countries that are starting to adopt it. So that was a great way of saying, look, companies have identified a problem, but they haven't really galvanized around a scalable solution. So we realized the problem was capacity and giving people the tools that can build their capacity to take action. So it became training, and we're doing it to this day. But what our folks often said is, I get it. I want to do that. I don't know how to do it. And if you could just give me everything I need right now and teach me how to use it, we can always add more sophistication and complexity later, but just give me the tools to do it and train me on how to do it. And that's often the thing we don't talk about when it comes to these issues around education and workforce development, is we just assume that if we get the supply side or education side right, the problem's going to be solved. And what I've liked to put attention on, and it was really kind of validated based upon our experience, is you have to build capacity on the demand side too. You can't just assume that employers are going to know how to do this or do it well and do it consistently. And that requires a lot of training and capacity, much like we put a lot of training and capacity on the supply side. So you can't neglect those demand side change management needs or just think the market's going to come up with a solution. You really have to lean into those, because build it and they will come strategies rarely work. And they might want to do it, but they need to know how to do it, and they need to be supported in doing it. That to me was a huge lesson learned, and one that I think needs to now be carried over into this conversation about non-degree credentials and how employers should think about them, how they could use them, and the use cases that matter most to them, and how do they know if it was successful or not. SHRM Foundation, Chamber Foundation are really trying to lean in on that to say, what are the resources and supports employers need to be better at this?
Right. Well, and just to name it, so we're right now in the middle of conducting a series of focus groups with employers and tech providers. We're partnered with Education Design Lab on this work, which is funded by Walmart and Charles Koch Foundation. And it is a whole project designed to understand that last mile to hire, that sort of "we built your car, now why won't you drive it" conversation. And in that conversation, universally, we ask folks if they've heard of learning and employment records, or LERs, and the number of hands that go up is consistently zero. So when Jason's talking about the education of employers and helping employers get to this place, we've got to recognize where we're starting from. And so we're about to make some investments to actually just do a general awareness building campaign around learning and employment records for our members at SHRM that is literally called LERs 101, and is like, what is a learning and employment record? How do you spell LER? Why should you care about this? Why is this a good thing for you? Because that's where we're starting. And then I think the other thing that sort of goes to this question of bringing employers along, and we're partnered with the Chamber Foundation and Business Roundtable on this, is figuring out how to get to common vocabulary and how to get to an increased number of known positive use cases for employers who've actually successfully done any of this stuff, so that people don't feel, Jason mentioned earlier that a lot of this is hypothetical or theoretical right now. It feels that way for employers for sure, but there is actually a ton of concrete stuff to do. It's just a little bit hard to see who's doing it, particularly because a lot of the employers who are actually making these deep investments are doing so behind closed doors and are hesitant to share the success stories that they're having, because those success stories are sometimes a little bit blurry when it comes to the percentages of people they've actually successfully brought into jobs who don't have degrees, for example. So I think whether you're talking about helping folks migrate their technologies, and we do know that HR professionals rely heavily on technology and also do not want to be the ones who get in the weeds figuring out which technology is for what, but also do want to have a say in what technologies they use and how they use them. So it's this murky space. Or you're talking about the more human aspects of transforming the way that one works. We're in a moment where there's a lot of hand-holding, like Jason's talking about, and it's sometimes stuff that has to be done one-on-one. We're working with Jobs for the Future on pilots where Jobs for the Future literally provides 60 to 90 hours of mentorship per company per week for 8 months. And that has a great, huge success rate. It also costs a lot of money. So we're trying to figure out, how do you navigate more employers through that sort of dark forest that they're not sure they want to walk through, and handhold them using technology, using digital interventions, using sort of incremental trainings, and then also using some amount of in-person mentorship and guidance in order to get more employers out there, so that there are more case studies and it starts to feel like this is the movement we're in, not the exception to the movement that we're in.
Two things to keep in mind when it comes to employer community. This is my perspective on it, given my limited experience. It's all about the use case and relevance. And, we come up with all these fun innovations and think they're game changers, but if they're not tools to help address a use case that's top of mind for an employer, they're not relevant. So to try to say, hey, we came up with this new kind of credential or this LER, and isn't it great? Use it. It's like, well, how does that help me solve the problem I'm trying to solve today? These are tools. And we don't want to fetishize the tool. We want to make sure it's a tool to help a workflow and to optimize results. So let's immediately find how to make this relevant to you, so you understand the right context for buy-in. And then the other issue is it has to be deployable now. And I think for a lot of folks, they get nervous if employers haven't been at the table or don't know enough about an issue, but it's also like, it's not if, it's when. And yes, you want employers to have kind of important feedback on during some of the early stages of things, But if you're pitching an employer being like, I've got something that's going to be a better tool in your workflow to get better results, and they say, I like it, give it to me. And you say, wait a minute, give me 2 years. Give me a year and maybe I can show you something.
Exactly.
You've lost them. You've lost them.
Exactly.
Like, they're like, then why aren't you talking to me a year from now? Why are we having this conversation now? So it's like, now you're gonna have some employers, obviously, these aren't just blanket statements, but they're gonna have the time, capacity, and interest to weigh in early. But for the vast majority, it's if you're gonna pitch me on something, I have to be able to use it tomorrow, and I have to be able to train up on it. We're not here to have academic conversations about it. So I think some of this is, yes, we're priming the pump, but I haven't used the word LER in our talent supply chains for many years as we were doing the R&D. Now we're finally starting to talk about it, and we're going to integrate it into our training starting next year, because that innovation is almost upon us. So we're going to actually be able to give them toolkits and resources to deploy solutions and to test. It's not just, trust me, it's a great idea, you'll see in about a year and a half. So I think this is actually a very exciting time because we actually have something we can use.
What you're raising is that, you're offering a solution to a problem. And I think that's a really pressing question in the field too, is that how do we know when we have good solutions? This big question around quality, around non-degree credentials, LERs, skills-based hiring. How do we know that what we're talking about here is a marker of quality in terms of identifying skills? And I'm curious what your thoughts are in terms of that quality assurance, need for quality standards, and what recommendations are needed to move that conversation forward.
I think that's a really good and very complicated question, in part because when I have dialogues about this, there's sort of presumption that we were in a moment where quality was a given, and now we're asking people to move into a moment where quality is not a given. And the reality is that there were plenty of people coming out of four-year universities who didn't know how to do their job at all. And coming out of really good four-year universities, the bulk of people actually end up in their first job and have to be trained on how to do it. And so that's not actually the shift. I was talking to Andy Tunsing, who works at the Charles Koch Foundation, one of the major funders in this space. And he was talking about how the success point in this is going to be when we can start to talk to employers about how this isn't a pivot from one thing to another. This is an expansion of the way you've always been doing it. And that you have always been thinking about a person to some degree, and then you interview them and you talk to them as humans, or you have them do a practical application, or you put them on the job and give them a 6-month grace period. And if they don't work out, then they move on from the job. And so the main thing that is shifting is the mechanism by which they get in the door. As Jason was saying, we're at the moment where we may actually be able to say to them, you know what, it's not going to be hard. It can be really easy. Here is a package of things that you can implement, and you can basically just keep doing the job you've been doing. Because I will tell you, the number one thing that employers don't want to do is go through and sift those 1 million credentialing options that are available from 60,000 providers across the world and figure out whether something has value or not. They would much rather presume that 4-year degree has quality than they would go through that process. And so having technology that can actually look at those and can, the EQUOS work that's being done, or the credential engine work that's being done, where they're tackling this question of what does a credential say it's going to do? And does that credential have efficacy, that actually someone who took it had those outcomes? When we can get to that part of the show, and all of that can be behind the curtain, and all you see is the wizard, and you're okay with talking to the wizard because you trust the wizard, then we're going to be, I think, in a really good place for most companies, because they are absolutely happy to have a candidate of quality, regardless of where that quality comes from, as long as they can trust that that person is getting there and has the skills they're going to need to survive and thrive in the job.
Michelle, from my point of view, looking at this question of quality, it's like, it's not a platonic form. And who gets to determine what is quality? And I would suggest, like in the business community, we do global supplier certification, and it's one system of supplier certification, but lots of different measures of quality, because the economy is very diverse. Supply chains can be incredibly complex, and you need to know who has the quality management systems and processes in place to be part of your supply chain. So you have all of these different kind of standards of quality that are stacked in one system, but you get to pick, this is what I want to be audited against. because this is one I want to represent in the marketplace because that's how I get business. And I think we need to apply that kind of same concept to this space to understand there's going to be all these different definitions of what is quality and in the eyes of whom. So I would suggest right now we have little to no signal from the business community on which institutions, programs, and credentials meet the business community standard of quality. And is there a single standard? So I don't think we've really figured this quality space out very well. I think with all the great history of higher education in this country, I would suggest we might not have quite figured it out there yet either. So I never want quality to kind of stop the innovation because we got a long way to go when it comes to quality. But one thing I'm getting excited about here is we have in our T3 Innovation Network something called a link claim standard. And we are now going to be developing a prototype tool. I'm getting a little ahead of my skis on this because we haven't really been out there on it. But without getting into the complexity of the technology, imagine this. Let's say you, Michelle, were able to award a non-degree credential to Clay, and it's conveyed, or it meets the definition of an LER. So Clay has a record that is a non-degree credential that has data about his learning outcomes and skills. Now, let's say Clay applies for a job with me and I bring him in. He's now my employee and we're in a performance review 6 months in, a year in, and I'm now looking at the skill claims or learning outcomes that were represented in that credential. And I am now going in and validating which of the skills have been demonstrated in a way that I think meets my test of quality, that they came prepared with the skill and Clay executed. So I can go in and now signal at the skill or learning outcome level back to the provider or whoever may be wanting to track that. Yes, I am validating that Clay said he has these 10 skills and I've seen 6 or 7 of them demonstrated with high proficiency. Couple, I'm not so sure, and some no. But I might not even be able to signal the negative stuff, but at least the positive stuff to say, I can't speak to all of them, but 6 or 7 of the 10, I'm going to say he had them. So you'll know, are the claims you're making about program completers being validated by the employers they work with? I think we're going to be at a point where we can actually send those signals.
Maybe I could just pose one question to wrap us up and to think about where this is all going. I'm really curious. You both are so deeply involved in the current discussions and envisioning a new future here. Where do you see this all going? What do you see as sort of the future direction here in terms of next steps of this conversation and all of the work that's happening right now?
I can talk about what we see as a challenge that we think we can help to solve, not we, SHRM Foundation, but we collectively, and where I think that might get us. And that is a sort of level of coordination across all of the different interested parties in this conversation in order to sort of together tackle this question of the end user that Jason was referencing, or the question of the driver of the car. If we can do that, and if we can figure out a way to coalesce the offerings that are out there in the world for employers, the trainings they can go through, the toolkits they can use, the systems and technologies that are going to make it possible, and we can put those together in a way that allows for employers to do this easily, to think this through, but think it through with as much help as possible. And then we pair that with the case studies, the points of success that are happening. I think that we can accelerate that tipping point for employer adoption. You know, it's going to feel like we're not there until we're there. And then all of a sudden it is going to become the thing. And I think the talent pipeline management stuff that Jason's talking about is really core to it. I think that some of the stuff that Jobs for the Future is coming out with, like their journey map, is really important to it. Education Design Lab and their X credits, which are trying to credential soft skills in a generation that seems to be viewed as not having them, is really important. The Opportunity at Work is doing all sorts of great work, including with us on a credential. So there's this amazing set of work bubbling. And I think if it can all come together and be pointed squarely at sort of making it as easy as possible for employers to say yes, then we will get to that tipping point, hopefully within the next few years. And our goal is certainly within 10 years to have tipped the bulk of employers over to a skills-based or skills-first hiring and advancement system.
Yeah, Michelle, how I'd answer that is we're going to get there with the technology. And I feel confident that technology is going to disrupt and help innovate our practice, including employer practices and workflows. And what I think, if I can stretch a little bit, where real disruption is going to come, and this has huge implications for non-degree credentials, is in financing. Because once the technology is there and I can now enable a skills-based labor market, and I can transact skills and I can make claims about skills, I can insert data about evidence, and we now have skills being transacted all over the labor market, skills which can be inside degrees too. It's not this versus that. It's all different ways you package them. But if we are able to get at that skills layer and everybody starts getting more and more comfortable with communicating the skills somebody has learned and the skills that I need for a job, and we can transact on these and the technology enables it, makes it seamless. I think the inevitable next outcome is how we finance all of this. Through our talent finance initiative at the Chamber Foundation, we actually co-chaired a work group with SHRM around exploring new employee education benefits. And one of the things that came out of that work group was this concept around a skill savings account and saying, if we actually change how employers use some of their education benefits today, and it's not about reimbursing $5,000+ for tuition, but if I were to able to give you money directly into a debit style account that you could go out and purchase skills that could be verified and conveyed through an LER, imagine what that could do for the marketplace. It's no longer $5,000 for tuition reimbursement. It's, I have $1,500 and I need to go buy skills today to upskill and reskill. And employers are willing to foot the bill because it's tied to their benefits and I can contribute money as well. And we could talk about how there could be certain tax advantages to that in the future. This whole idea of, if you just got employers to think about their education benefits differently, imagine 1/3 of today's workforce with an average balance of $1,500 in a skill savings account where they could purchase skills and receive a non-degree credential. That would total up to about a $90 billion upskilling or reskilling marketplace. Now imagine that year after year. That's 3 times Pell on a great year. We think once the money shifts for how we no longer just finance degrees, but also how do we finance skills? And what is the transcript of choice for those skills? I think this thing's going to go to the next level. And it's going to raise even more questions within the education debate, because I think you're going to have a lot more providers out there. And it's not all going to be taxpayer money that's backing this up. And what I mean by that is Pell grants, other workforce grants, like individual training accounts, or even loans. But now you're going to have employee investments in skills. And that's not going to come with all the baggage of taxpayer investment. So where I think it's going to get real interesting is this is going to meet the financing space. And then I think we'll see if there's going to be a real disruption or not. And I see it as actually a big opportunity, because anyone who's in the education business now, including community colleges and universities, it's going to open the doors to all new revenue and the ability to reach more learners who have been in the workforce, may never even step foot in a college before, or who have already gotten a degree and now are looking to upskill and reskill. So I think the market is going to expand. And I think the ability to now offer and convey skills is going to prove to be extremely relevant, given where the labor market's going and how employers are going to be hiring going forward.
Right. That could be truly transformative. Gosh, there's so many fantastic topics and points that you both have raised today. I really am so grateful for the chance to just have this conversation and get your thoughts on where things are and where things are going. And truly fascinated to sort of see where these conversations continue to go and evolve. So thank you so much, Jason. And thank you so much, Clayton, for the insights that you've shared in this conversation. I really appreciate it, and look forward to continuing the conversation with you both as our ongoing work continues together in this field.
Thanks for listening to A Third of Your Life, the Rutgers School of Management and Labor Relations podcast. For more information on our academic programs, faculty, and research, visit smlr.rutgers.edu.